Every morning, millions of Americans wake up half awake, half zombie, and do exactly one instinctive thing: reach for coffee. Not because they're hungry, not because they're thirsty, but because everyone else is doing it. You don't think about it, you don't question it, you just drink. The same way you grab your phone and start scrolling before you even remember what day of the week it is. We call it a habit, we call it a tradition. Some people even call it culture, which sounds very serious and important. But the slightly uncomfortable truth is this: a lot of what you believe about coffee and tea exists not because it's true, but because it's convenient. Convenient for history, convenient for money, convenient because you don't have to think in the morning. And if you think that cup of coffee is just a natural part of life, the first story is about to make you see it very differently. Story 1. Your morning coffee is not as natural as you think. We like to believe morning coffee is as natural as the sun coming up. As if Stone Age humans once sat in a cave, looked at each other very seriously and said, "Yeah, no latte today, this mammoth hunt is not happening." But here's the truth. For most of human history, coffee had nothing to do with mornings. It was seen as weird, overstimulating, even suspicious. The kind of drink that made people talk too fast and look just a little unstable. Coffee is basically an app that came pre-installed in your brain. No one remembers when they downloaded it. No one remembers agreeing to the terms and conditions, but everyone opens it every single day. And if one morning you don't drink it, your coworkers look at you like you just announced you don't believe in Mondays. That cup of coffee in your hand is not tradition. It's the result of hundreds of years of extremely good storytelling. And this is only the first story. Story 2. The Boston Tea Party wasn't about expensive tea, it was about tea being too cheap. In school, most Americans are taught that the Boston Tea Party was heroic. The colonies were furious about high tea taxes, so they dumped tea into the harbor to protest oppression. Sounds noble, sounds inspiring, perfect for textbooks and dramatic paintings. There's just one tiny detail that usually gets skipped. The tea wasn't expensive at all. In fact, it was cheaper than ever. In 1773, the British government allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out middlemen. That made legal tea cheaper than smuggled tea. And that's when a certain group panicked. Not poor citizens, not everyday tea drinkers, American merchants who had been making serious money off smuggling. So the Boston Tea Party wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was also a very well-organized business meltdown where people about to lose profits threw tea into the ocean and called it patriotism. Classic. Story 3. The goat herder legend might just be ancient fan fiction. If you've ever heard the origin story of coffee, it probably starts with a goat herder in Ethiopia. His goats suddenly start bouncing around like they just downed an energy drink after eating some weird red berries. So he tries them too. Boom! Coffee is born. It sounds adorable, very cinematic, the kind of story that makes you nod and not ask follow-up questions. There's just one problem. This story doesn't show up in a single written record until more than 800 years after it supposedly happened. No notes, no witnesses, no evidence. Just a perfectly packaged plot. It feels less like history and more like a legend designed to make coffee sound mystical, the same way every brand needs an inspiring origin story. The truth was probably much simpler, and a lot less poetic. History doesn't always lie, sometimes it just adds a few details to make the story better. Story 4. When English women tried to ban coffee because they thought it was making men useless. In 1674, women in England did something very modern. In a very old-school way, they wrote a petition to ban coffee. Not for health reasons, not for religion, but because they believed coffee was ruining their men in a way that was unacceptable. The document had a very serious title: The Women's Petition Against Coffee. The content, not serious at all. They complained that their husbands were spending way too much time in coffee houses, talking politics, debating world affairs, and worst of all, becoming useless at home. According to them, coffee made men thin, weak, overly talkative, and short on action. Basically a 3-hour Zoom meeting in human form. This wasn't really a war on coffee. It was a war led by exhausted wives whose husbands loved hot black water more than coming home on time. And somehow coffee survived. Story 5. When coffee was once called the devil's drink. When coffee first arrived in Europe, the reaction wasn't, "Wow, this is great." It was, "Yeah, this feels dangerous." Some church leaders looked at this dark, bitter liquid, the one that made people way too alert, and reached a very on-brand medieval conclusion. This must be the devil's work. Coffee was labeled the bitter invention of Satan. And yes, there were very serious suggestions that the Pope should ban it to protect Christian souls. This sounds like it's heading toward a dramatic ending. But then comes the most relatable plot twist. Pope Clement VIII decided to actually try it. According to legend, he took a sip, paused, and laughed, basically saying, "This is way too good to ban." So instead of exiling coffee, he blessed it. And just like that, with one sip, coffee went from drink of the devil to perfectly acceptable morning fuel for millions of faithful people. History is wild like that. Story 6. Kopi Lusaka. The luxury story that makes you not want to drink it anymore. Kopi Lusaka is usually introduced as the peak of sophistication, a rare expensive coffee selected by nature. Wild civets eat only the best coffee cherries, digest them naturally, and humans simply collect what's left, roast it, and sell it for a price that makes you question your financial decisions. Sounds fancy, also very wrong. The modern reality has very little to do with nature and a lot to do with cages. Most Kopi Lusaka today is produced by keeping civets in tiny enclosures, force-feeding them low-quality coffee day after day. The animals are stressed, exhausted. And the coffee? Not better, just sadder. You're not buying a unique culinary experience. You're buying a beautifully told story designed to cover up a very ugly truth. And this is where luxury should probably be replaced with unnecessary. Story 7. High tea isn't fancy, it used to be a meal for hungry workers. Today, high tea sounds elite. Tiny pastries, fragrant tea, pinkies slightly up. Everything very Instagram. Luxury hotels love the phrase. They sell it like a promise that you're about to live like British royalty at least for an hour. There's just one problem. They're using the term wrong. In the 19th century, high tea was not for bored aristocrats. It was a heavy, no-nonsense meal for working-class people in England after a long day in factories and coal mines. We're talking meat, potatoes, bread, beans, and tea strong enough to wake the entire neighborhood. The word high had nothing to do with social status. It referred to the high table they ate at because they were starving and needed real food. The delicate tea with pastries and lace that you're picturing, that was actually called low tea. So if you booked a high tea to feel fancy, my condolences. You accidentally ordered a 19th century worker's dinner. Story 8. Sticking your pinky out doesn't make you more aristocratic. There's one move people swear instantly makes them look fancy, sticking out their pinky while holding a teacup. Like it's some secret upper-class code. Pinky up elite, pinky down peasant, at least in their imagination. Reality says the opposite. In modern etiquette, lifting your pinky while drinking tea is usually seen as trying too hard. The kind of move that screams, "Please notice how refined I'm being." And that almost always backfires. The habit may trace back to a time when people drank tea from small, handleless bowls, using multiple fingers just to keep things balanced. But with today's handled teacups, the pinky has no polite purpose at all. It doesn't signal elegance. It signals that you're performing a role no one asked you to play. If you really want to look classy, just drink your tea normally. Real aristocrats don't need a pinky to prove it. Story 9. A coffee bean isn't a bean, and you've been saying it wrong your whole life. We call it a coffee bean with full confidence, like there was never another option. Bean is bean. Sounds right. Feels right. So the entire world just agreed to be wrong together for a few hundred years without questioning it. Here's the problem. Coffee is not a bean. Botanically speaking, the coffee plant produces a fruit that looks a lot like a cherry. What you call a bean is actually the seed inside that fruit. In other words, every morning you're not drinking roasted bean water. You're drinking an extract made from the seed of a fruit. We only call it a bean because the first people who saw it thought, kinda looks like a bean, and decided to move on with their lives. And the name stuck. Because if we were being accurate, you'd have to tell your barista you want a cup of roasted fruit seed water, which doesn't sound great, so we keep saying it wrong. Because it's convenient. Sometimes language isn't correct, just extremely efficient. Story 10. When you say chai tea, you're saying tea. In a coffee shop, there are few sentences said with more innocent confidence than "I'll have a chai tea." It sounds international, cultured, like someone who's traveled. There's just one tiny issue. In Hindi and many South Asian languages, the word chai simply means tea. So when you say chai tea, linguistically speaking, you're ordering tea. It's like saying ATM machine or PIN number, just more aromatic. What you actually want is masala chai spiced tea. But that's a longer phrase, and not everyone wants to stand at the counter sounding like they're reading a dictionary. So the whole world collectively agrees to say it wrong together. The baristas just smile. They've heard it about 300 times today. No one corrects you, because sometimes repetition itself becomes culture. Story 11. Orange Pico has absolutely nothing to do with oranges. When people see orange Pico on a tea box, their brain does the most natural thing possible: orange. Fresh orange, citrusy orange. Oh, this one's probably easy to drink orange. Then they brew a cup, take a sip, and quietly wonder where the orange went. Here's the truth. Orange Pico has nothing to do with oranges. No smell, no flavor, no citrus surprise. The word orange comes from the House of Orange-Nassau in the Netherlands, a royal name slapped onto tea to make it sound more prestigious and more trustworthy. And Pico, that doesn't mean flavor either. It refers to the size and grade of the tea leaves. That's it. So you didn't buy orange-flavored tea. You bought a leaf classification with a very clever name designed to look better on a shelf. This isn't some massive scam. It's a small classic one so subtle it survived for hundreds of years without anyone bothering to ask. Story 12. Dark roast coffee is often weaker than light roast. Your tongue just got fooled. A lot of people believe the darker the roast, the stronger the coffee. More bitter means more caffeine. Sounds logical. Your tongue agrees. Your body does not. Roasting coffee is basically baking. The longer you roast it, the more water the beans lose. They expand, they get lighter. Caffeine is pretty stable, but when you scoop a spoonful of dark roast, you're actually getting less material than the same spoonful of light roast. Fewer beans, less caffeine. That intense bitterness makes your brain scream, "Wow, this is strong." But that's just your taste buds doing way too much. In reality, a cup of light roast coffee usually gives you more caffeine even though it doesn't feel as aggressive going down. So if you picked dark roast to stay more awake, my condolences. Your tongue won, science did not. Story 13. Espresso isn't the caffeine bomb you think it is. Espresso has a very aggressive image. Tiny cup, pitch black. One sip and you're awake like someone just yelled in your face. So people assume espresso must be the most caffeinated thing in the coffee universe. The truth is, slightly less cool. Yes, espresso does have more caffeine per ounce. But here's the catch: you only drink a tiny amount. A single shot of espresso usually contains less caffeine than a giant cup of drip coffee you carry around all morning. That weak-looking coffee quietly feeds caffeine into your system over a longer time and in a larger total dose. Espresso is like a quick slap. Regular coffee is like a long, committed hug. No one's lying to you, your brain just overreacts to the tiny, intense cup. So if you need to survive an entire meeting, the big coffee is the real threat. Story 14. Tea isn't stronger than coffee, it's a very useless technical truth. There's a fact people love to repeat because it sounds smart: tea has more caffeine than coffee. Everyone nods, feels informed, feels deep. The problem is, it's almost useless in real life. Yes, if you put dry tea leaves and dry coffee beans on a scale, tea can contain more caffeine by weight. But no one drinks tea by chewing dry leaves. You use a small amount of tea for an entire pot of water, while coffee uses a much larger amount of grounds for a single cup. Once everything is brewed and sitting in your mug, coffee almost always delivers more caffeine than tea. So saying tea is stronger than coffee is like bragging that a spoon of salt is saltier than a pot of soup. Technically correct. Completely unhelpful when you're trying to wake up in the morning. Story 15. Espresso beans don't exist, only labels do. If you've ever stood in a grocery store and seen a bag labeled espresso beans, you probably thought, oh, these must be stronger, more premium made, specifically for espresso. Sounds logical. That's the trap. In the botanical world, there is no such thing as an espresso bean. There's no espresso plant, no secret espresso tree grown in the mountains. Espresso is a brewing method, not a species. What's usually labeled espresso beans is just very dark roasted coffee. Dark enough to be easy to extract, easy to control, and hard to mess up under high pressure. The word espresso just makes it sound more professional and sell better. You can absolutely pull espresso from light roast coffee, and you can brew drip coffee with espresso beans. No coffee police are showing up at your door. Sometimes marketing isn't lying. It's just choosing words that sound smarter than the truth. Story 16. Decaf still has caffeine and you didn't escape. Decaf is usually ordered with a deep sense of peace. You set the cup down and think, good, I'm mature now. No caffeine, my heart won't drum like a war soundtrack tonight. Sounds reasonable, also very optimistic. Here's the reality. Decaf doesn't mean no caffeine. It means less. The decaffeination process removes most of the stimulant, but it can't erase it completely. A cup of decaf still contains a small amount of caffeine, enough for your body to notice if you drink a few cups back to back. So if you've had 4 or 5 decafs in a day and you're lying awake wondering why sleep won't show up, the answer isn't your age or your stress level. It's sitting right there in that safe cup. Decaf is a polite compromise. You didn't quit caffeine, you just pretended you broke up with it on good terms. Story 17. British tea culture actually started with a Portuguese princess. When people think of England, they think of tea, afternoon tea, morning tea. Tea for literally any situation that might occur. It's treated like a national identity right up there with rain and standing in orderly lines. But there's one small detail that usually gets skipped. The British didn't originally make tea an everyday habit themselves. Before the 17th century, England drank more beer than tea. Tea was expensive, rare, and mostly treated like medicine. Everything changed when King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, a princess from Portugal. She brought tea with her. She brought the habit of drinking tea. And she asked for a cup of tea every single day. The British aristocracy, wanting to look like the new queen, started copying her. And just like that, British tea tradition was born from royal imitation, an imported habit repeated long enough to become identity. Turns out culture is very good at copying too. Story 18. Old coffee houses were closer to riot zones than chill spots. When you think of a coffee shop today, you picture slow Wi-Fi, quiet indie music, and someone in the corner working on a novel that will probably never be published. A place to relax, a place to chill, a place to pretend you're being productive. 17th century coffee houses complete opposite. They were loud, smoky, packed with political arguments, rumors, and hot takes. People didn't go there to relax. They went there to argue. They were called penny universities because for the price of one coin, you could walk in and hear opinions on everything, economics philosophy, and how to overthrow the government. They got so intense that King Charles II actually tried to ban coffee houses, claiming they were spreading dissent and brewing conspiracies. Compared to that, modern coffee shops with oat milk lattes and calming playlists look less like cultural hubs and more like waiting rooms. So next time someone says a coffee shop is a quiet place, remember this. It used to be the birthplace of chaos. Story 19. Iced tea wasn't invented at a fair like you think. There's a very American story everyone's heard at least once. Iced tea was invented at the 1904 World's Fair. It was hot. A tea vendor panicked. He threw ice into the tea. Boom, national drink. It sounds great, creative, peak improvise, and succeed. There's just one problem. It's not true. People in the American South had been drinking cold tea for decades before that. Cookbooks from the 19th century already had recipes for chilled tea, often called tea punch. Iced tea wasn't a sudden invention. It was a regional habit that got credit stolen. The 1904 fair in St. Louis didn't create iced tea, it just made it famous. Kind of like how selling a ton of hamburgers doesn't mean you invented the hamburger. The fair story survives because it's neat, memorable, and very American. The truth is simpler. Iced tea had been around for a long time, it just hadn't found a big enough stage to tell its story yet. Story 20. The French press is actually an Italian design wearing a French hat. The name French press makes everything feel settled. France invented it. France perfected it. France has been drinking coffee this way since berets and philosophy arguments were mandatory. Sounds right, which is why most people never question it. Here's the twist. The French did have an early idea, but it leaked, grounds was awkward to use, and was kind of a mess. The smooth, functional version you actually recognize with a tight rubber seal and an effective metal filter was patented in 1929 by an Italian designer named Attilio Calamansi. So the French press sitting in your kitchen is basically an Italian product wearing a French name. Like selling pizza in Paris and calling it premium French cuisine. France wasn't wrong, Italy just finished the hard part. The name stayed, history shrugged, and everyone moved on. Story 21. Coffee doesn't make you short, that was dirty marketing. If you grew up hearing, "Don't drink coffee, it'll stunt your growth," you're not alone. A lot of Americans heard it from parents, teachers, or some adults saying it with the confidence of someone who just finished reading a classified government study. Here's the issue. Science was never on that side. There is zero solid evidence that coffee or caffeine slows height growth. So where did this myth come from? Marketing. In the early 1900s, a businessman named C.W. Post wanted to sell a coffee substitute made from grains. To do that, coffee had to look scary. So coffee got blamed for everything damaging nerves, making kids worse at school, and yes, making you short. Parents panicked. The substitute sold well. Coffee got a bad reputation that stuck around for decades. So if you're short today, don't blame that latte you had at 16. Blame your genetics. And one extremely dirty marketing campaign. Story 22. Coffee doesn't dehydrate you. Doctors just exaggerated a bit. There's a warning every coffee drinker has heard: too much coffee will dehydrate you. It sounds serious, like every cup is one step closer to becoming a raisin. The truth is far less dramatic. Yes, caffeine has a mild diuretic effect. It makes you pee a little more. But mild is doing most of the work here. The amount of water you get from a cup of coffee is much greater than the amount you lose because of caffeine, especially if you drink coffee regularly and your body is used to it. Studies show that for habitual coffee drinkers, coffee still counts as water. It doesn't cancel out its own hydration. You're not in negative balance. So your morning coffee isn't drying you out. It's still hydrating you. Some doctors exaggerated because it's easier to remember, and because saying just drink water is safer than explaining physiology for 5 minutes. Story 23. Green tea doesn't melt fat like influencers claim. If social media were right, all you'd need to do is drink green tea and belly fat would disappear like ice in the sun. Influencers say this with impressive confidence, usually in front of a mirror with perfect lighting and a flat stomach that didn't need green tea to begin with. Reality is less magical. Green tea does contain antioxidants. It can slightly increase metabolism. Very slightly. So slightly that you'd need to drink an almost ridiculous amount of green tea every single day to burn the calories of half a cookie. But green tea is generally good for you doesn't sell. Green tea burns fat while you sit there sells extremely well. So pills appear, powders appear, miracle promises appear, and the science gets trimmed down to fit a caption. Green tea is a good drink, it is not a liquid gym. If it really burned fat the way ads claim, we'd be living in a very different world. Story 24. Putting coffee in the freezer usually makes it worse. There's a life hack that's been passed around forever. Put your coffee in the freezer to keep it fresh. It sounds scientific. Cold preserves things, freezers protect meat, so coffee should be fine too. And just like that, a lot of people park their expensive coffee beans right next to frozen fish. Here's the problem. Coffee is not meat. Coffee beans are basically tiny sponges. They absorb smells, they absorb moisture. They absorb the ghost of last night's frozen pizza. Every time you take coffee out of the freezer, warm air hits cold beans and condensation forms. And moisture is flavor's #1 enemy. Unless you divide your coffee into small portions, seal them completely, and never open and close the bag every morning, the freezer usually makes coffee age faster, not slower. This life hack isn't wrong because it's malicious. It's wrong because coffee is sensitive. And because freezers were not designed for beans with feelings. Story 25. Milk before or after tea used to be a class signal. The argument over milk before or after tea sounds incredibly petty today. The kind of topic people bring up at parties just to feel like they have a strong opinion. But a few hundred years ago, in England, the order actually said exactly who you were in society. The upper class poured tea first, then added milk. Why? They owned expensive porcelain that could handle boiling water. The working class did the opposite. They poured milk first to cool the tea down, otherwise their cheaper cups might crack right on the table. So this choice wasn't about flavor, it was about what kind of dishes you could afford. Milk first wasn't uncivilized, it was a survival strategy. Today you can argue the order purely on preference. But history reminds us that even a cup of tea used to be a class battlefield. And that war was fought very quietly right there on the dining table. Story 26. Slurping tea isn't rude in many cultures. In many Western households, slurping your tea or coffee is considered bad manners. Drink quietly, make no noise. If there's a slurp sound, you'll probably get that look, "Who invited this person?" But in many parts of the world, especially in Japan and China, slurping is completely normal. Sometimes it's even a compliment. When you slurp air mixes with the liquid, that helps open up the flavors, makes aromas clearer, and cools the tea faster before it hits your tongue. In other words, it's not bad manners. It's technique. The issue isn't the sound, it's that we're used to one rule book and assume it applies to the entire planet. Slurping here is rude. Slurping somewhere else means you know what you're doing. So if someone drinks their tea a little loudly, they might not be disrespectful. They might just be enjoying it in a different way. Story 27. Cappuccino has nothing to do with monkeys. A lot of people think cappuccino is connected to capuchin monkeys, which, fair, same color, similar name, and the human brain loves connections that feel right even when they're completely wrong. The real story is much less animal-themed. The word cappuccino comes from the Order of Friars Minor Capuchin in Italy. These monks wore light brown robes with very distinctive hoods. When Italians mixed coffee with milk and got that same light brown color, they named the drink cappuccino, literally meaning little hood. The monkey came later. Capuchin monkeys were named because they looked like they were wearing the monks' hoods. So the order is monks first coffee, second monkey, dead last. In other words, when you drink a cappuccino, you're not drinking monkey coffee. You're drinking a liquid monk hood. Not more delicious, but at least historically correct. Story 28. The saucer was once meant for drinking. Today, the saucer has a very humble job. Catching drips, holding a spoon, keeping your table clean. Drinking tea or coffee from the saucer sounds weird. And a little unhinged, like something that would get you stared at in a Starbucks. A few hundred years ago, totally normal. Back then, tea and coffee were often poured while still nearly boiling. Drinking straight from the cup was a direct attack on your tongue and teeth. So, people did the smart thing. They poured the drink into the saucer. The wider surface area helped it cool faster, and people would simply sip it from there. The saucer wasn't decorative, it was a rapid cooling device. If you did that today, you'd look like a social experiment. But in the past, drinking straight from a hot cup was the uncivilized move. History has a funny way of turning normal things into strange ones and strange things into etiquette. Story 29. Instant coffee was commercialized by a man named George Washington. When Americans hear the name George Washington, their brain instantly loads one image: white wig, military coat, serious face, founding father. Absolutely not a guy stirring instant coffee in his kitchen. And yet, history pulled a very clean prank. The person who successfully commercialized instant coffee was actually named George Constant Washington, not the president. This George was a Belgian-born inventor living in the US in the early 20th century. He realized that dried coffee could dissolve back into hot water and thought, that's convenient. And he was right. His product became wildly popular during World War I, when soldiers needed caffeine fast portable and didn't really care about flavor. They called it a cup of George. So yes, George Washington did help America stay awake. Just not the one you learned about in history class. Story 30. Bach once wrote music praising coffee like a full-on addict. When people think of Johann Sebastian Bach, they picture seriousness, big white wig, church music, sacred vibes only. Not exactly the guy you'd expect to defend a controversial habit. And yet, Bach loved coffee, very publicly. In 1735, he wrote a piece called Coffee Cantata. It's a musical story about a young woman who is so obsessed with coffee, she'd rather fight with her father than give it up. In the lyrics, she praises coffee as sweeter than 1,000 kisses and more pleasant than wine. Read that again. This is classical music from the 1700s, and it's basically saying, don't take my coffee. In other words, it's a very old composition with extremely modern energy, a full musical defense of the right to stay caffeinated. Kind of like a 30-minute coffee commercial written by a genius. So if you ever think coffee addiction is a modern problem, remember this. One of the greatest minds in history literally wrote a whole piece of music just to say, coffee is amazing. Story 31. Coffee isn't a bad habit, it's actually America's biggest source of antioxidants. For years, coffee has been labeled a bad habit, an addiction, a guilty pleasure, something you enjoy but always with a slight sense of shame, especially when your doctor pauses just a little too long. But modern nutrition research landed on a very ordinary conclusion. In the average American diet, coffee is often the single largest source of antioxidants people consume in a day. Not leafy greens, not fruit, that morning cup of coffee. Not because coffee is magical, but because we don't eat enough of the other stuff. Quietly, coffee stepped in to fill the gap. It's not a miracle cure, it won't turn you into a superhero, but it's also not the villain it was made out to be. So after 31 stories, the most reasonable conclusion is this. Your cup of coffee isn't a tradition, it isn't a sin. It's just a very human part of modern life. And now you know the story behind it. Final thought. It was never about coffee or tea. After all these stories, the most important thing probably isn't whether you drink coffee or not. It's whether you understand what you're drinking. Coffee and tea aren't heroes, they're not villains either. They're just very human things, overhyped, misunderstood, and repeated long enough to feel traditional. Once you know the story behind them, you stop drinking on autopilot. You drink with awareness, with choice, and with a small smile because it turns out a lot of what we call tradition is really just a well-told story. So the next time you hold a cup of coffee or tea, you don't need to feel suspicious. You don't need to feel guilty. Just remember this, you're not following a habit, you're making a choice. And that's always better.